Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Before we go any further, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Yunjin Lee. I got a PhD in English Linguistics from the Department of English Education at Gwangju National University, and I teach students at Gwangju University. It's a great honor to have an opportunity to present my research in this general session. From now, I will brief you on my research on exploring the relative pronouns of the English language. One of the grammar items that Korean English learners have the most difficulty with is relative pronouns. The reason why learners feel they are the most difficult and have a hard time learning them has to do with the difference in word order between Korean and English. To be more specific, the relative clauses in each language share a similar usage. But why the relative clause in Korean appears before the noun that in English modifies the noun from a past nominal position? On top of this, the types and rules of the relative clauses differ by the noun they modify, which explains the difficulty experienced by EFL learners. Thus, the purpose of this paper is to identify what kind of difficulties Korean students in the EFL environment are faced with when learning relative pronouns and to explore various teaching and learning methods in order for learners to engage in more natural learning of the subject. Let's start by looking at screen. Here is the overview of my presentation. My presentation will take about 20 minutes and is divided into 4 sections. In order to understand the theoretical background of relative pronouns, I will start with section 1 about the theories of relative pronouns by exploring how some of the representative scholars defined relative pronouns. And in section 2, I will divide the relative pronouns into categories and explore how those in each category behave differently. Common relative pronouns, compound relative pronouns, and pseudo-relative pronouns. In section 3, I will state the usage of relative clauses, restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses, and see what the difference is. Lastly, for those learners who experience difficulty in English due to the different grammar structures between their mother tongue and the target language, the conclusion of this paper will be drawn effective teaching methods for relative pronouns that can help motivate students' interest from an educational aspect. To begin with, let's move on to section 2 about definition of relative pronouns. Here is the theory suggested by different scholars from existing studies in order for the definition of relative pronouns. First, Kirk and Greenbaum classified pronouns into personal pronouns, reflexive pronouns, relative pronouns, interrogative pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, and indefinite pronouns. And relative pronouns hold the meaning of making a relation, which includes the function of the conjunction. The scholars mentioned commonly define relative pronouns as serving both roles as pronouns and as conjunctions. Let me explain the reasons for their argument by considering the following examples on slide. As shown in this slide, you can see the examples in 1A and 1B My brother is immediate because it refers to the same person, and the phrase who lives in Paris modifies the noun phrase that appears before it, my brother. Here, the relative pronoun that introduces the subordinate clause is called the relative clause, and we call the noun antecedent that is modified by the subordinated clause introduced by who. In English, in order for two verbs to occur in one sentence, there should be a conjunction. In 1C, the relative pronouns who serves as a conjunction then connect two sentences. Thus, relative pronouns serve as both pronouns appears after the antecedent and modifies it, and in this sense, it's an adjectival phrase. Let's now take a look at types of relative pronouns. Relative pronouns can be divided into three types: common relative pronouns, compound relative pronouns, and pseudo relative pronouns. In order to understand the meaning of a relative pronoun in a relative clause, it's important to understand first which type of relative pronoun serves which role in a given context. Common relative pronouns include who, whose, whom, which, that, and what. Please look at the table 1. Relative pronouns can be classified according to case as follows. In the perspective of traditional grammar, who occurs when the antecedent refers to a person, with each variant who for a nominative case, whom for an accusative case, and whose for a genitive case. When the antecedent refers to an animal or an object which occurs, with each variant being which for a nominative and accusative case, and a which or whose for a genitive case. When a person, an animal, or a thing appears as the antecedent, who and which can be substituted with that. That does not change in form for a nominative or accusative case. What includes is antecedent in itself and appears in the nominative or accusative case, usually functioning as a noun phrase that occurs in the subject, object, or complement position. I will explain theories of the relative pronoun that in the following slide. Jesperson heard that the relative pronoun that should be viewed not as a pronoun but a relative conjunction or a particle. This is because that does not have a plural form as other pronouns do, and it does not allow a preposition before it. Besides, the theory on the relative pronoun that suggested by Jesperson. Let us look into other theories as well. Generally, that in the relative clause has been referred to as the relative pronoun, but Bers-Arch maintains that it is not a relative pronoun, but it's just a subordinate conjunction, which introduced the relative clause. The reason that Bers-Arch makes such an argument is that pronouns can occur as the complement of a preposition like to whom or to which, but the same does not apply to the conjunction that like the person to that. Thus, it can be regarded as the collapse of the conjunctive function. I will show you some examples from Bers-Arch on slide. In 3a and 3b, there is no overt relative constituent, but there is a covert relative phrase expressed as were, meaning implicit relative elements. In 3a, the antecedent of that is not power. That of the covert relative phrase before that is, and this relative phrase act as the subject. In 3b, the antecedent of the covert relative phrase is work, and is the direct object of the verb do. As such, when relating to the non-subject position, that can be omitted. Compound relative pronouns are a combination of a noun and a relative pronoun into one word. It's an addition of ever at the end of general relative pronouns. Who, what, that, which, resulting in whoever, whichever, whatever. As general relative pronouns serve various grammatical functions in a sentence, compound relative pronouns differ in their usage depending on the function. But usually they introduce noun phrases or consecutive adverb phrases. As presented on PPT, whoever changes in form into whoever or whomever, depending on the case. In a sentence, a noun can occur immediately after whatever or whichever, and they serve as the compound relative adjective. The meaning of each compound relative pronoun is as follows. Whoever means anyone who, and whichever means anything which, and whatever means anything that. Thus, they are classified according to the case of the word they modify, and they are relative pronouns that include anyone or anything as the antecedent. Therefore, while relative clauses precede an adjective clause that modifies the antecedent compound, relative pronouns precede a noun clause. Let us consider some examples in which compound relative pronouns precede a noun clause. As I mentioned earlier, compound relative pronouns are followed by a consecutive adverb clause. Such a case emphasizes the non-restrictiveness and supports the consecutive meaning. Adverb phrases following a compound relative pronoun are separated from the matrix clause with a comma like number 5, example on the screen. Now let's turn to the relative pronouns. Pseudo-relative pronouns serve a similar role as relative pronouns, but they do so in a sentence of a different structure than relative pronouns, such as which, that, and what. There are three pseudo-relative pronouns as, then, and but, which are also classified as conjunctions, but they change in case in a sentence, modifying the noun that occurs before the clause following them. In such a sentence, it's important to note the correlative words that occur with the antecedent. In the next section, let's take a look at the usage of relative pronouns. The relative clause introduced by the relative pronouns can be divided into two usages: the restrictive usage and the non-restrictive usage. A relative pronoun that imposes a restriction on the antecedent is called the restrictive relative pronoun. And the restrictive usage does not have a comma before the relative pronoun, and the relative clause modifies the antecedent before it. Thus, It gives semantic restriction on the antecedent, while modifying and interpreting the antecedent when it gives specific information on the antecedent to refer to a type of person or an object. Relative pronouns in the restrictive usage include who, which, and that. To look at the characteristics of the restrictive usage, please look at the examples on the screen. In 6a, the relative pronoun imposes restriction in that one of the boys singing on the stage is the son. In 6b, the same is true in that the hotel Tom recommended is a particular hotel. And then to look at the characteristics of the restrictive usage, let us consider the following examples. Prepositions can occur in a restrictive relative clause in which who, which, or that in the restrictive usage acts as the object of the preposition. Second, the following is when there is a double restriction in which two clauses restrict the antecedent. In 8a, the first that and the second that restrict the antecedent to nothing. In 8b, the first which and the second which restrict the antecedent item. In the non-restrictive restrictive usage, the relative pronoun is accompanied by a comma before it. Unlike the restrictive usage where the relative pronoun explains what kind of person or object the antecedent refers to. There is no restriction on the antecedent and the purpose is to supplement with additional information. The meaning is interpreted from the beginning to the end of a sentence. Let's move on to section 4 about conclusion. In this paper, it has looked at the theories of the relative pronouns suggested by scholars and the types and roles the relative pronoun. The most important point in understanding the relative pronoun in short is that it serves a pronominal and conjunctive role. When combining two sentences into one, the noun that is repeated or overlaps is called the antecedent, which occurs immediately before the relative pronoun. The relative clause restricts the noun, so functionally it's an adjective. And types of relative pronouns include common relative pronouns, compound relative pronouns, and pseudo-relative pronouns. Also, the paper suggested the difference between the restrictive usage and the non-restrictive usage of the relative pronoun. The most obvious way to distinguish between the two is the former difference, the use of comma. Restrictive usage, the relative pronoun has a close grammatical relationship with its antecedent and cannot be separated. In the non-restrictive usage, on the other hand, the relative clause provides additional information about the antecedent and can be separated from the matrix clause with a comma. To draw a conclusion based on this paper, the relative pronoun is the most unfamiliar and difficult subject of grammar for learners whose target language is English, but it's an important aspect in the current English curriculum in that it's a very frequently asked grammar item on KSAT every year. Hence, teaching the subject in a memorization-based method Using grammar exercises will lower students' interest in it. The problem gets worse as the grade advances with longer texts and more complicated structures of the relative pronoun, which may cause to take more time for learners to interpret the sentences. Therefore, the teacher is required to have a systemized knowledge on the relative pronoun according to the different levels of learners, and to help them understand that the relative pronoun is not a grammar item to memorize, but a language form that differs in structure from their first language. The first method is a form-focused language instruction in which various methods are used to stimulate learners' interest and to help them develop a natural learning of grammar forms. The second method presented is task-based language teaching, in which learners participate in pair or group activities and communicate in the target language to accomplish a given task, while realizing how useful the activity is in improving their language proficiency. Besides, these two methods suggest teaching through games and teaching through audio-visual media and the internet. Namely, the teacher should explain the grammatical knowledge about the relative pronoun and the relative clause, and then have students make pairs or groups to practice the sentences and notice their weakness, so that the grammar is internalized in them. It's important that this process is accompanied, accompanied, accompanied by speaking or writing practice. On top of such methods, further teaching methods should be designed through research in order for more effective English education on the relative pronoun. That brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.